Before you watch this, do one thing. Subscribe now, and turn on notifications. Because this story does not let go once it starts. Did they hear it coming, or did they trust it? What if the person who tucked you in at night was already planning how you would die? Why were two children left sleeping in a house soaked in blood? And why did this begin as a missing persons case, when the truth was already waiting inside? The screen fades in on a quiet suburban street. No sirens. No screams. Just silence so heavy it feels wrong. A door stands closed. Inside, the air is thick, metallic, unmistakable. Blood stains the floor where love once lived. A man and a woman lie motionless, executed with precision, their bodies cooling while time keeps moving. Upstairs, two children breathe softly, unaware they are sleeping feet away from death. This wasn't a break-in. Nothing was stolen. No struggle. No chaos. Which means the killer didn't force their way in. They were let inside. Someone who knew the house. The routine. The perfect moment to strike. Someone who knew exactly where to stand, where to aim, and when to pull the trigger. This is not just a murder story. It is a story about trust turned into a weapon. About love twisted into control. And about how the person who knows you best can destroy you the fastest. If you're still here, stay. Watch to the end. Because the truth only gets darker from here. Before you continue, hit the subscribe button so you won't get lost. Two children slept peacefully, while both their parents were already dead. The house did not look like a crime scene. No flashing lights. No shattered windows. No screams cutting through the night. Just a quiet suburban home, sitting still beneath the glow of a street lamp that hummed faintly, like it always did. Inside, the air was heavy. Not with smoke or chaos, but with something colder. Something final. Down the hallway, a bedroom door was half closed. Small chests rose and fell beneath cartoon blankets. A soft breath. Then another. The children were dreaming, unaware that their world had already ended. Unaware that the people who tucked them in, who kissed their foreheads, who whispered goodnight just hours earlier, would never speak again. Outside, the neighborhood slept. A car passed. Somewhere, a dog barked once, then went quiet. Nothing sounded wrong. Nothing looked wrong. That was the most disturbing part. For hours, no one knew where they were. A phone buzzed on a kitchen counter, vibrating itself into silence. A message unread. Another call missed. Somewhere else in the city, a clock ticked past the hour Spencer was supposed to be at work. A colleague frowned. A family member hesitated before dialing again. He always answered. He was always on time. The house did not answer. Behind the locked doors, two bodies lay where they had fallen. No struggle echoed through the walls. No alarm was raised. Whatever had happened, it happened quickly. Quietly. With purpose. By the time anyone began to worry, it was already too late. This is not a disappearance story. But it started as one. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications because once this story is darker than you think. Spencer Teep was the kind of man who arrived at work before sunrise, his hands steady, his movements deliberate. A dentist by profession, he was meticulous, reliable, and quiet in his ways, a man who noticed the smallest details others overlooked. Patients trusted him, not just for his skill with tools, but because he radiated calm authority. He had a way of making people feel safe, even in vulnerable moments. He never raised his voice, never lost his temper. Friends and colleagues described him as consistent, dependable, a man of habit. Every morning, he walked the same route from his home in Columbus to his clinic, briefcase in hand, coffee in a travel mug, nodding politely to neighbors who waved. There was comfort in his predictability. Monique Teep, on the other hand, thrived in quiet moments at home. She was devoted to her children, fiercely protective, and intensely private. A mother who measured her words and actions with care, she made the house feel warm and lived in. Photos lined the hallway, smiling children holding crayons, family vacations to lakeside cabins, birthdays marked with candles and laughter frozen in snapshots. Her eyes, dark and expressive, always seemed to be scanning, calculating, shielding. She carried the weight of the past with discretion, never burdening those around her. Even in her serenity, there was a subtle tension, a carefulness that hinted at vigilance, the kind that comes from experience, from knowing the world can shift in an instant. Together, they presented a picture of normalcy, dinner around the table, laughter echoing softly in the evenings, bedtime routines that were precise, loving. Friends visiting never guessed at the undercurrents, the unspoken shadows that lingered just out of sight. It was the kind of quiet life that lulled neighbors into complacency. The most dangerous stories don't begin with chaos, a colleague would later say, they begin with quiet. And in the Teep household, there was nothing but quiet. The mundane rhythms of brushing teeth, packing lunches, reading bedtime stories, all followed by a stillness that almost whispered, as if the walls themselves were holding secrets. No one imagined that beneath this calm surface, the pulse of danger had already begun to thrum. Every smile, every hug, every soft word was a prelude to the nightmare that would unravel in a house that seemed too ordinary to harbor such darkness. The ordinary is the perfect disguise. And in that quiet, the most sinister story had already started. The morning began like any other, quiet and unremarkable, but something in the rhythm of the day felt off. Spencer Teep, usually precise in his routines, did not appear at the dental clinic when the doors opened. His receptionist frowned at the empty chair in the waiting room and glanced at the clock again. He never missed a morning appointment. Another colleague called his cell phone. Ring. Ring. Nothing. Again. The line went straight to voicemail. At home, Monique's phone sat silently on the counter, unanswered, messages left unread. Friends and family began to feel a creeping unease. Spencer never missed these calls. He always replied immediately, even if it was a simple, "On my way." The more the hours passed, the more a knot of dread tightened in their stomachs. By mid-morning, colleagues began making notes, sending emails, checking his calendar. He had no meetings canceled, no alerts. The pattern of his life, so rigid, so reliable, was broken. At the same time, Monique's closest friend arrived at the house, a sense of worry lining her face. Knocks on the door were answered only by silence. A chilling quiet hung heavy, almost tangible, in the air. The neighbors noticed the lack of movement too. No car in the driveway. No sounds of children playing. Even the family dog was unusually quiet. Hours ticked past, sunlight shifting across the rooms, shadows lengthening. Phones rang, messages pinged, and yet, nothing. The stillness grew oppressive, a slow-burning alarm in the chest of anyone connected to them. Finally, a welfare check was requested. 2 officers arrived and approached the front door. Knocks echoed in the empty hallway. "Mr. Teep. Mrs. Teep. Are you home?" Silence. The sound of their own voices seemed to bounce back at them from the walls. No footsteps, no movement, no response. It was as though the house itself had swallowed the couple whole. Time stretched on, hours bleeding into one another, each second amplifying the sense that something was terribly wrong. The ordinary day, the breakfast, the commute, the small routines, had twisted into a growing, unbearable tension. Every unanswered call, every silent room, every shadowed hallway whispered a question no one wanted to face: where were Spencer and Monique Teep? And what had already happened inside their quiet, unassuming home? The officers approached the Teep home with a weight that pressed against their chests. Officer Daniels, African-American male in his late 30s, tall and deliberate, and Officer Riley, Caucasian female, mid-30s, methodical and calm, exchanged a brief glance before knocking. "Mr. Teep. Mrs. Teep." "This is the police," Riley called, her voice echoing against the quiet suburban street. No response. Not a footstep, not a creak of floorboards, nothing. Another knock, louder this time. Silence. The air felt heavier, almost viscous, pressing into the officer's lungs. They tried the door handle. Locked. Daniels retrieved a set of keys, but the locks yielded only after a brief struggle. The door creaked open, revealing the familiar warmth of the Teep household, yet something was immediately wrong. The smell was faint but unmistakable, a metallic hint that made Riley instinctively glance down the hallway. Sunlight filtered through blinds, soft and ordinary, but the shadows now seemed sinister, stretching along walls that should have been comforting. The living room appeared undisturbed. A coffee cup half full on the counter. Chairs pushed neatly under the table. Nothing had been overturned. No evidence of struggle. For a moment, Daniels whispered, "Maybe they're just out somewhere." But the silence in the air, thick and unnatural, told another story. They moved toward the hallway. There, Monique Teep lay on the floor, lifeless. Her eyes were closed, expression oddly serene despite the violence inflicted. Medium dark skin tone, natural curly hair, casual home clothing. Daniel stiffened, heart hammering. "Oh my God," he muttered, stepping closer. And then, a step further down the hall, Spencer Teep. Dead. Mid-30s, medium dark skin, short curly hair, clean-shaven, wearing a loose shirt and pants. Calm. Lifeless. Shot in a manner suggesting precision, intent. No forced entry. No robbery. Nothing had been taken. Everything was as it should have been, except for the fact that the people who belonged here were gone. The children, two small African-American kids, a boy and a girl, 5 and 7, lay asleep under blankets in their room. Unharmed. Innocent. Their eyes flickered slightly in dreams. Unaware. Riley crouched beside them, checking each, whispering reassurance. "It's okay, sweethearts. You're safe." The officers looked at one another, a shared understanding forming. This wasn't random. This wasn't a break-in gone wrong. This was deliberate. Methodical. And in the quiet of the Teep home, the weight of that realization pressed down like a heavy, unyielding fog. Silence stretched. Seconds felt like minutes. The mundane house, the one filled with laughter, bedtime stories, and family routines, had become a stage for a darkness that no one could have anticipated. The world outside continued, unaware, while inside, the most intimate and horrifying violation of safety had already been etched into memory. The hallway of the Teep home was heavy with silence, the kind that pressed into every corner, filling the space with an almost physical weight. Officer Daniels stood just inside the doorway, eyes scanning the neat, undisturbed living room, while Officer Riley crouched beside the children, whispering soft reassurances. They exchanged a glance that didn't need words. Something about this scene felt deliberate, precise, intentional. It wasn't chaos. It was method. Daniel's hand drifted to his radio. "Dispatch, we're on scene. No signs of forced entry. House is secure. Victims located." The words sounded clinical, sterile, but the gravity of the situation hung between them. In cases of random violence, there was always a mark of struggle, a broken lock, a window shattered in haste. Here, there was nothing. Everything was as it should have been, except the lives inside. Riley stood, brushing a stray curl from her face, voice low. No robbery. Nothing missing. No signs of a struggle. Whoever did this, they knew the house. Knew the family. Her words weren't a guess, they were observation, measured, analytical. Every angle they considered, every detail examined, pointed to a grim conclusion: this was not random. This was personal. Daniels knelt beside Spencer's body, tracing the line of the wound, noting the precision. Look at this. Single entry point, close range. Whoever did this, they were comfortable here. They weren't afraid. They weren't forced. They knew exactly what they were doing. His tone was calm, almost detached, but the tension coiled tightly beneath it. Riley moved to Monique's side, noting the same clinical precision. No signs of robbery, no valuables taken, no forced entry. This wasn't about money, not about anything material. It was about control, access, intimacy. Someone they trusted, or someone they knew intimately. Her voice dropped slightly, the realization sinking in. The children's soft breathing in the next room accentuated the eerie stillness of the household, a stark contrast to the calculated violence that had unfolded just feet away. Daniel stepped back, eyes narrowing. Intimate partner violence, he murmured. Not a theory, not speculation, an observation based on years of experience. Most murders in homes like this, when there is no forced entry and no theft, trace back to someone close. Someone familiar. Someone who understood the rhythms of the household, the comings and goings, the quiet patterns of everyday life. Riley exhaled slowly, her gaze shifting toward the children. This isn't about what happened, she said. It's about who could do this. Someone with access. Someone with trust. Someone who knew exactly where to strike and how to leave the rest untouched. Her words lingered in the room like a shadow, heavy and suffocating. The reality settled over the officers. This was not a random act, not an intruder in the night. The killer had been inside the family's life long before the shots were fired. They had watched, waited, and chosen the precise moment to act. And now the question that haunted the room, unspoken but palpable, was the one that would drive the investigation forward. Who among those closest to the Teep family had turned familiarity into deadly intent? The Teep house had been silent for hours, the kind of silence that seemed to seep into the walls themselves. Officer Daniels moved slowly down the hallway, eyes lingering on the untouched furniture and the meticulous order of the home. Nothing appeared out of place, yet the precision of the crime had already etched itself into his mind. Across the room, Officer Riley adjusted her gloves and looked toward the children, asleep, untroubled, unaware. But outside, in the shadows of the investigation, a new angle began to surface, darker than anything the house itself suggested. Monique Teep's past was not easy to trace, but every lead, every whispered conversation with friends and family, began to form a chilling outline. Years before Spencer, there had been another relationship, one marked by intensity, affection, and eventually, fracture. A divorce had followed, quiet but tense, leaving scars that never fully healed. Friends had spoken in hushed tones of arguments that lingered in the air long after the door closed, of glances that carried unspoken warnings, of veiled threats that were never reported but always felt. Daniels glanced at Riley, his expression grim. "There's history here," he said. "Not with Spencer, but with Monique. Someone from the past." Riley's eyes narrowed, mind already connecting the dots. Divorce, past obsession, alleged threats. This isn't random. This isn't someone just walking in. Someone held on, too long. The officers began piecing it together, the psychological patterns emerging as clearly as the evidence. Escalation often followed separation, studies had shown. When love ended but obsession remained, control could turn lethal. Threats that once seemed empty suddenly became warnings. Phone calls, notes, brief confrontations, they were the prelude. The house, so meticulously ordered, now reflected the final act of someone who had waited, watched, and calculated every step. Riley crouched beside a kitchen table, scanning a notebook of interviews with friends and neighbors. "Fear doesn't leave when love does," she murmured. "It lingers. It mutates. And sometimes, it finds a way to finish what it started." Daniels nodded, his eyes drifting back to the hallway where the bodies lay. Spencer had been reliable, predictable, orderly, but this wasn't about him. This was about someone who had once loved Monique, who had once believed they controlled a part of her life, and now, in their twisted logic, believed the only way to reclaim that control was through violence. Evidence and instinct converged. No forced entry, no robbery, no strangers lurking in the night. Everything pointed to someone intimately familiar with her routines, her home, and her life. The past was no longer a backdrop, it had become motive. Every unanswered call, every unreported threat, every lingering tension from years before had led here, to this day of horror. Riley exhaled slowly, her voice low, almost to herself. The past, it never really stays buried. Not for some people. And some fears survive long after love is gone. Daniel's hand rested lightly on her shoulder, acknowledging the weight of that truth. Outside, the neighborhood remained calm, unaware of the storm that had been building quietly, patiently, long before the first shot was fired. Inside, the past had finally caught up, and the consequences were irreversible. The shadows in the house seemed to deepen, swallowing the light as the officers realized that the story they had stumbled into was not just about death, but about obsession, lingering control, and the terrifying persistence of fear long after love had disappeared. The investigation into the Teep murders had begun to coalesce into a chilling narrative. Officer Daniels and Officer Riley sat in the small, dimly lit command room of the precinct, files spread across the table, photos of the crime scene and neighborhood maps scattered in meticulous order. Every detail, every timestamp, every witness statement was pieced together like a dark puzzle. The timeline began to take shape. Spencer had left for work but never arrived. Monique's calls went unanswered. Hours passed. The welfare check revealed bodies. The children were safe, but the horror had already settled over the house. Daniels leaned over the photos of the front door, noting the lack of forced entry, the pristine locks, the careful placement of personal items. "Look at this," he muttered, pointing to a small, barely visible smudge near the kitchen counter. Nothing else was touched. Whoever did this had intimate access. Riley's gaze followed his finger. And the timeline confirms it. The call from the neighbor reporting unusual silence came just 30 minutes after Spencer should have left for work. Whoever it was, they knew exactly when the house would be empty of adult presence. The detectives turned to the list of people closest to the family. Friends, co-workers, neighbors, ex-partners, anyone with a reason or opportunity. Monique's past, the divorce, the lingering threats, everything pointed to someone who had maintained a disturbing obsession. A name kept surfacing, whispered in interviews with neighbors and friends, a shadow from Monique's previous life who had been watching, waiting. Riley's hand trembled slightly as she traced a series of phone records. The suspect had called repeatedly, leaving cryptic messages, subtle threats that no one had initially recognized as dangerous. "It wasn't random," she said softly. "It was methodical. Planned. Calculated. Every contact, every movement, deliberate." By evening, the pieces were in place. The officers moved in. Daniels and a tactical team approached a modest apartment not far from the Teep home. The suspect, a male in his mid-30s, was found inside, attempting to hide evidence and gather his things. His expression was a mix of shock and defiance when the officers identified themselves. Handcuffs clicked into place, and the suspect was read his rights. He remained eerily calm, almost as if he had expected them. Riley stepped aside to observe, noting the meticulous nature of the evidence the suspect had attempted to conceal: notes, maps, phone records. The arrest was clinical, precise, and inevitable. The suspect had been revealed, his obsession laid bare. Everything now fit into the horrifying mosaic: access, motive, timing, and the twisted calculation that had transformed lingering obsession into cold, deliberate murder. Outside, the night had fallen, but the darkness inside the precinct seemed heavier, charged with the knowledge that the past had finally caught up with him, and with tragic, irreversible consequences for the Teep family. The precinct was quiet now, the hum of fluorescent lights above casting a cold, sterile glow across the evidence tables. Officer Daniels leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the photographs of the Teep home. The images were ordinary at first glance, the children asleep, the neat kitchen, the family photos, but the violence beneath them refused to be ignored. "Why that night?" he murmured, almost to himself. "Why leave the children alive?" Riley glanced up from a stack of reports, her brow furrowed. "It doesn't make sense. If it was about control, obsession, or revenge, leaving the kids, it's cruel, but deliberate. They had to know the parents were alone at that moment." Her voice was soft, reflective, but there was tension threading every word. She tapped a photograph of Monique on the table. Her expression was faintly scared, caught mid-smile in a casual family snapshot. "She must have known something," Riley continued. "Something we don't. Something that made her fear the one person she thought she could avoid." Daniel's eyes traced the trajectory of the evidence again, the smudges, the untouched valuables, the timing. "Everything here tells a story, but the story isn't complete," he said. "We can reconstruct the timeline. We can map the calls, the movements, the suspects' patterns. But the truth, the real why behind every choice, that's fragmented. We'll never fully know what passed through their minds in those final hours." Riley's hand hovered over the children's photographs, eyes softening. "Justice is procedural. It can convict, imprison, punish. But it can't give us certainty. It can't explain fear, obsession, or what someone might have whispered in those last moments." She shook her head slightly, as though the weight of it pressed physically on her. "Some things are never answered. Some things remain in fragments, pieces we can assemble but never complete." The officers fell silent, letting the images and files speak in their absence. Outside, the quiet suburban night continued, indifferent to the horror that had occurred. Inside, the fragments of the case pressed in, the calculated violence, the lingering fear, the questions that would echo indefinitely. Why that night? Why the children? What did Monique know? What did the suspect plan, and how had he convinced himself it was right? Daniels exhaled, eyes returning to the crime scene photographs. "We can pursue justice," he said quietly, "but truth is elusive. It's in the fragments. In the gaps. In what evidence shows, and in what it will never show." Riley nodded, staring at the children's peaceful faces in the photos. "And sometimes, that's all we can hold on to. The fragments. The shadows of what happened. The unanswered questions that refuse to leave." The room fell back into silence. The evidence remained. The questions remained. And in the quiet, the weight of the unknown pressed like a shadow over everyone involved, a reminder that some stories refuse to be fully told. The children slept on, unaware of the storm that had raged in their home, their small hands curled beneath their chins, breaths shallow and even. The house around them, once a sanctuary of warmth and laughter, now felt hollow, shadowed by the echoes of violence. Officer Riley lingered just outside their room, glancing at the soft light falling across their faces. She whispered to Daniels, her voice low, almost reverent, "It'll never feel the same here, never." Daniels nodded, his gaze drifting to the photographs scattered across the living room table. Every detail of the crime, the precision, the planning, the chilling calm of it all, pressed like a weight against his chest. "It started as a disappearance," he said softly, "and ended as a warning. A message embedded in fear and control." He shook his head, voice catching slightly. "And the children, they're the only ones untouched by the worst of it, but nothing about this home will ever feel safe again." The officers moved through the house slowly, careful not to disturb the fragile stillness. Every room was frozen in time, every shadow a reminder of what had happened. The staircase, the kitchen, the living room where Monique and Spencer had spent so many ordinary nights, they were now silent witnesses. Daniels paused at the doorway of the bedroom, looking back at Riley. "This is the part that gets you. The quiet devastation. The knowledge that someone so close, someone who knew them, knew exactly how to break them." Riley's eyes lingered on the children one last time, lingering on the innocence that survived the calculated cruelty. She whispered, almost to herself, sometimes the person who knows you best, knows exactly how to destroy you. Let us know in the comments what you think about the whole story.